Greetings, angry demonstrators.
It's amazing what a little heroism gets you and guts. So thank you for joining us.
Oh, my pleasure.
It's a pleasure to Alan and I go back to Iraq for sale days when we first met, and he was then speaking out fearlessly and ferociously, and we bonded at during the film and after the film. And then when he announced he was running for office, I was beside excited. I said, well, it's a great candidacy. Of course, he'll never win, but it's a great candidacy. And it'll be, you know, another losing battle, but we'll all feel virtuous.
No, I'll tell you. I wake up every morning and I say, I can't believe I'm a congressman. And all over Orlando, Republicans wake up every morning and they say, I can't believe he's a congressman.
What a wonderful thought. I'm going to remember that when I wake up tomorrow morning, of all those Republicans in Orlando waking up so I wanted to ask you a sort of a general question, which interests me with people of integrity. Your political positions, clearly they're a part of your DNA. Were they always that way? Was it a transformation at some point in your life?
No, actually, no. And that's a very interesting question. I sometimes ask people the same question, of course, not in front of the world, the way you're asking me that question. But it's fascinating where people get their political beliefs from. And I can tell you that it hasn't changed much at all since I was a boy. You know, I grew up in a union household. Both of my parents were union members. Some people actually rebel against that. I never really felt that way. I understood the difference between fighting for the people and fighting against them. And it stuck with me. And it's interesting, when I was a law clerk, a judge assistant at the District of Columbia Court of Appeals, at that point, I worked with all the judges who were there at that time. It included Judge Ginsburg, now Justice Ginsburg. The famous or infamous Judge Starr was there at the time. Judge Mikva, who later became President Clinton's White House attorney. And Judge Scalia, who later became Justice Scalia. And I got to work with all of them up close. And at that time, Justice Scalia told me, the very last day we were together, he told me, one day you will be a conservative. I said, really? And I said, why do you think that? And he said, because one day you'll be fat and happy. Well, he's half right. Not quite there yet.
Good. And had you always thought about one day running for office? Was that in your mind any place? And if not, tell us a little bit about the process of deciding to run and how that came about and what drove you towards it.
Well, I've always been interested in public affairs. I got a master's degree in public policy when I was at graduate school at Harvard. And I've read the news section of the newspaper religiously. Remember newspapers, right?
Yeah. Rings a bell.
Right at the time that people watch TV, they also used to read newspapers. And it's been interesting to me as a subject my whole life, but it's a really different thing when you actually engage. And I think you know this too, because you've had earlier points in your life when you were somewhat less engaged than you are right now. And it's a decision that you have to sort of come to. In my case, what happened was I got involved in prosecuting war profiteers in Iraq. And the Wall Street Journal, which probably regrets this at this point, sent a reporter to Orlando to profile me and my work. The profile ended with the thought, maybe Alan Grayson will run for Congress. And when I saw maybe Alan Grayson will run for Congress in the Wall Street Journal, I said, maybe Alan Grayson should run for Congress. And the rest is history at this point. I didn't do anything about it for a long time. And I think you've known enough people in public life so that you know there is a sort of a self-selection process. And it really has nothing to do with how qualified you are. It has more to do with how much you want it. I think that politics is one of the few areas where actually many people think that being unqualified is a qualification. We have this sort of meme in our head that we want the citizen elected official who comes out of nowhere, and Mr. Smith who goes to Washington. So you end up with this odd selection process where the prime qualification is you have to want it. And for the first half century of my life, I just never wanted it. And then I decided I did.
And were there some incidents or events in the external world that made you want it, or personal, or combination?
Well, the war. I mean, the war got me much more involved in doing the people's business than I was ever involved before. The war changed my mind about how important it was to be engaged. As hard as we were fighting to prosecute war profiteers in Iraq, I knew I could do nothing to end that whole tragedy, or for that matter, to end the war, which I regard as a tragedy, unless I did something like this.
And how did you come to get involved in fighting the war profiteers? Was there some
I had been doing government contracts work for the whole time since I finished being a judge's assistant. I was always involved in that because I'd gotten a master's in public policy. I knew a lot about procurement. So I'd sort of gravitated toward that. And over time, I did more and more work representing whistleblowers, less and less work representing contractors. You know, the contractors' legal work just tends to be contractors fighting over pots of money, whether it's who gets the business or a claim against the government for more money or whatever. The whistleblower work is fundamentally different from that. The whistleblowers are witnesses to fraud. And originally, at the very beginning, I got exposed to that work because I was working for a firm that sometimes defended companies who were charged with that. But I found it much more interesting when I was off on my own to actually be prosecuting those cases. And the law, since Lincoln's time, gives us the opportunity to do that. You can represent whistleblowers and bring lawsuits in the name of the government, and then try to recover the fraud that's been committed against the government, and then you get a share of the recovery. That's called the False Claims Act. So I became rather well versed in those cases, and when the war came, those cases just exploded. But the problem was no one else was willing to take those cases anywhere in the country because the Bush administration wouldn't do anything to help. In fact, they did everything they could to stall these cases. They got court orders, gag orders, for all these cases, to keep these cases under court-ordered seal. If the client spoke about it or if the lawyer spoke about it, you actually would be in contempt of court and you could be put in prison. So for years, they just swept these cases under the carpet, and other lawyers, rather than saying, they said, why should I spend my time on these cases? Why should I care about these cases if the government doesn't care about these cases? Why should I care about fraud if the government doesn't care about fraud? But I felt differently, and we pursued the cases as much as we could. They finally, after years, unsealed one case where they thought it was an absolute dead loser that the government couldn't possibly recover, so they let us pursue that one, and that was the Custer Battles case, which in the end we won, and we got a $14 million recovery against Custer Battles for the fraud that they committed. And after that case was unsealed, the cases started to dribble out, and even today I'll tell you for a fact that there are cases that I filed that are still under seal. And I'm hoping that the Obama administration will eventually take a different view of these things than the Bush administration does, but they're just sort of getting around to figuring out what they want to do, and it hasn't been a dramatic change yet. We'll just have to wait and see.
And you're introducing some legislation, as well as others are, around contracting and war profiteering and stuff. Do you want to sort of give us the lay of the land legislatively on what can be done and what can make a difference? Because I think one of the fundamentals we're wrestling with in this time is a belief that nothing makes a difference. And it's in some ways a bigger enemy than the right is, I think, for many people who've become demotivated.
Well, right. I mean, you're absolutely right about that. The enemy is enemy. The sense that you can't get anything done, and it's also complicated, and why even try? And that kind of apathy is what ends up letting the other side win, because the other side is always incredibly motivated by their hatred and their fear. But to answer your question, we've introduced two bills which we're actually going to be pursuing this week in the course of a rule committee meeting. One bill has to do with the fact that the contractors are never held responsible for their own cost overruns. You know, you have contractors who basically buy into the work by telling the government, oh, we think we can do this cost reimbursement contract for $300 million. And they end up charging the government $4 billion. And by law, this is a strange thing, hard to believe, but by law, they don't have to pay any of that. So I introduced a rather modest bill to say that they have to pay 10% of it. They have to pay 10% of whatever the cost overruns might be on their contracts. And we'll see how that works. The fate of that bill will be decided. It's never decided forever, but it'll come up again, and the immediate fate of that bill will be decided this week. But we'll just keep trying. If we get it, fine. If we don't, we'll just keep pushing it and pushing it until we get it, because that's the way it ought to be. A second bill that we're going to be involved with this week of the same general nature is that, as you well know, the Defense Department often gold plates projects, you know, the $600 toilet seat and so on. We've all heard of things like this. One of the ways they can get away with that is that they can say in the cost of their evaluations that the proposed price hardly matters at all. They can say that 99% of the evaluation process will be around the so-called quality of the item, and 1% will be around the cost of the item. So they can fiddle with the evaluation process to get any sort of gold plating that they really want. I think that's not right. I mean, we live in a time of limited resources. The government's deficit is $1.6 trillion this year. The Defense Department accounts for $1 trillion in spending. I think you've heard my views about that in general, but the point is that procurement is out of control. So our suggestion is that when you have an evaluation scheme deciding how you're going to buy something, whether it's a hammer or whether it's a plane, you have to consider the cost of it at least 50%. That's our proposal. Our modest proposal is that at least 50% of the decision has to be made based upon the cost. And we're going to be pursuing that this week as well.
And then there's some other bills. Jan Schakowsky has one, I think, and a few other people, different permutations around contracting. So explain to us a little bit in terms of process. How much of your time and efforts go into sort of trying to build the greatest number of sponsors or co-sponsors versus sort of staking out the territory, and because there's value in both, right? It's different.
You know, it depends entirely on the situation. It turns out that there's a lot of pressure points that you can work on, even if you're a freshman Democrat in the House. And one way that you just described is what you just described, which is getting co-sponsors. That's what worked in the Audit the Fed bill. We picked up a bill that was introduced originally in a long time ago, when I was still in graduate school, 26 years ago. The bill had never even gone to a hearing. This is Ron Paul's bill to audit the Federal Reserve by means of the GAO. He had never even gotten into a hearing, even when the Republicans were in charge for 12 years, and he was the chairman of the relevant subcommittee, because he just couldn't galvanize the support. We took that bill. I walked it around the floor of the House. We got 150 Democratic co-sponsors. I spent week after week, when we were voting on other things, telling people about the bill. And the result of that was that we ended up with 150 Democratic co-sponsors. All the Republicans were co-sponsors. We had a really pitched battle in the committee to get the bill passed because the Federal Reserve was dead set against it. But we ended up winning in the committee 44-26, if I recall correctly. And the result of that was that it ended up in the final version of the Financial Services Reform Bill, which the Senate is now considering. So we'll see how it turns out in the end, but one way you can make a difference is by getting co-sponsors for that. And in fact, honestly, looking back on the entire 100th, 11th Congress, which is now more than half over, I can't think of any other substantive bill that we've passed in the House that was truly a bipartisan bill. And the way to do that was to sign people up, explain the bill to them, get their support, and also have them understand why people were calling and talking to them about the bill, why they were sending emails, what it was all about. So that's one way to do it. Another way to do it was what I just described. The Rules Committee entertains the possibility of having votes on the floor concerning certain amendments every time a bill comes up. And it's entirely up to the leadership and the Rules Committee exactly what those amendments are. But if there's a bill coming up that's on one subject, and we're dealing with a defense procurement bill this week, then you can propose amendments that are germane to that. And we're active in that area as well. On my two committees, we introduce bills, we introduce amendments, we do a lot of things. If the bill is not coming from my committee, like another example that I could give to you, then the result of that is that we find other ways to try to influence that, whether it's through the Rules Committee amendment process, working with friends on other committees, people of like minds, in introducing amendments to their markups and so on. There's a lot of ways to do good.
And there's a couple of questions that sets off, one of which when we talked on the phone and talked about doing this was, so one of the fundamental questions I wanted to ask you, which is, how is it possible that a freshman, namely yourself, has been able to accomplish so much in so many different levels, and many other decent, reasonable human beings who people in this room have probably worked very hard for, who go to Congress and either disappear, get buried by the process, or become, at least from the outside, seemingly afraid of their own shadow?
I think I was pretty reticent for the first few months that I was there, and just trying to get a sense of what the job entailed and how one could possibly do anything other than simply show up and vote. And also trying to get a sense of what I felt about the institution, the people I served with, the Democrats, the Republicans, the caucus, the White House, and so on. And the thing that I remember really being a turning point for me was that the Speaker allows all the members who are Democrats, including the freshmen, the chance to be in the Speaker's chair. And for 1 week earlier, well, close to a year ago now, I got to be in the Speaker's chair. And that required me to listen to the debates during the bills. And it happened that that week we were entertaining and voting on the hate crimes bill. And I heard from the Democrats exactly what you would expect, you know, how awful it is that we kill people because of their race or their religion or their sexual orientation, whatever it might be. And I heard from the Republicans basically apologia, one after another, for hatred. I heard Republicans say that you have the right to hate. It's in the First Amendment. That why are we even inquiring as to why people kill? What's the difference why they kill? I can't even describe to you the silliness and the horror of many of the things that they said to me. They were simply, basically, explaining why they thought hatred was good. And that sort of crystallized it for me, and I realized that I was in an environment where there weren't two sides to every argument. If that's the best they could come up with, you have the right to hate. I didn't really feel like there was any need to even think about things like bipartisanship anymore. That we needed to just accomplish what we need to accomplish. To protect the victims in society, to do what we've known for 3,000 years is the goal of every just society, to shelter the homeless, to feed the hungry, to heal the sick. So that sort of made up my mind for me about what kind of work I wanted to do while I was in Congress. And then it was just a question of finding a way to do it.
So in terms of that, I want to talk about Afghanistan a little bit. You and we have been among the few and the lonely speaking out from the very beginning on that with our Rethink Afghanistan campaign, which you've been incredibly supportive about. And it seems to us that there is an opportunity here. I won't even call it bipartisan, but reaching people of various political persuasions around Afghanistan. Particularly, we're now focusing on the cost of the war, which people have not computed in any shape or form. What opportunities do you see there in general around moving the elected officials? And the ones I've talked to seem to be quite terrified of taking the issue on in any shape or form, even generally good people. Is it policy? Is it pressure? Is it some combination? Is it an intellectual argument? What's going to get us out of this horrible policy?
Well, I think the Democrats in general were very good on the war until the president got elected. And then the president's election gave many Democrats this out, which was to say, well, he's the commander-in-chief, he knows best, let's just go ahead and do whatever he says. And the president himself took an out, which is to say, I'll just do whatever the generals tell me to do. You know, he asked the generals, how many troops do you need? Which is, you know, like asking a Wall Street bank, do you want more money? You know, honestly, I have 5 children. They range in the age from 15 to 5. I have twins who are 5. It would be asking my 5-year-olds, do you want more candy? That's what we're talking about here. It's the wrong question to be asking. So the Democratic leadership and the Democratic rank and file in the Congress deferred to the president. The president deferred to the generals, all of whom had been generals under Bush and were trying to rationalize the errors that had been made earlier. And they basically stopped thinking. They went on automatic pilot, and they've taken us to the position we're in right now. And automatic pilot when you're in war is more war. It's okay to be an automatic pilot when you're in peace. You know, that tends to perpetuate peace. But here we are in the 9th year of one war, the 7th year of another. And in fact, I'm concerned that people have gotten used to war. If you read the book, Orwell's book, 1984, you realize that what makes that society possible is endless war. That's the rationale for having cameras in people's bedrooms. It's the rationale for dictating to people what kind of work they do, what kind of life they lead. It's the basis for a totalitarian society is endless war. And I'm very concerned that people here in America are getting inured to that. I think that's very possibly the worst thing that can happen to us, because it's very simple to take away the things that make any country great if you immerse it in a draining, endless war, and that becomes the rationale for all the other things that you try to do to take away the population's freedom. So we'll see. We'll see how it works out in the end. But a lot of what we do, a lot of what you do, I think, is just to make people think about the war again. Because I think a lot of people have just accepted it. They think that being at war is like breathing. Mm-hmm. You know, it somehow is an inevitable part of life, when in fact it's not. I gave a speech on the floor of the House that I was particularly proud of a few months ago, called The Power of Peace. If you, let's see if I can do this. Do I have any money in my pocket? Let's see. Let's see. We'll check this out here. It's on YouTube, for like everything else, I guess. Okay. It turns out that if you look back at what the Founding Fathers left to us in terms of communicating with us, it's almost entirely words. We have, of course, the Constitution, the Declaration of Independence. We have the Federalist Papers. We have the letters that they wrote to each other, and not much else. We have one image. The image is this. This is the Great Seal of the United States, and it's on the back of our dollar. If you look here, you'll see that the American eagle here, in one hand, is having spears, and in the other hand is holding an olive branch. The spears represent war. The olive branch represents peace. And if you go back and you check, you'll find that the reason why the eagle is looking to the eagle's right or left is because the eagle is looking at the olive branch. This is a conscious decision on the part of the Founding Fathers, representing the Great Seal that probably every single person in this audience has in his or her pocket. And in particular, you'll find that the reason why they wanted the eagle to be looking at the olive branch is what they described as the power of peace. They recognized that this is a country like any other country that at all times decides between war and peace. In our case, we really do make that decision. Nobody at this point forces war on us. We're the most powerful country on the earth. So when we're at war, it's because we want to be at war. And in doing so, we lose and we forego the power of peace. You know, the peace to take that takes the resources that we would otherwise devote, you know, the lives and skills and abilities of young men and women, and instead of devoting them toward teaching the next generation or toward making us healthier, instead sends those young men and women 8,000 miles away at the cost of $1 million per soldier each year, in order to do, I cannot even tell you what. I'm not even sure what they're doing over there anymore. I went over there and I couldn't even tell what they were doing over there. So I think that if we keep telling people over and over again about the power of peace, all we're doing is reminding them of that. The Constitution, which has been the subject of a lot of conversation lately on the right, it turns out that nowhere in the Constitution is there anything that would justify foreign occupation. Nothing. You know, there's the great debate about whether the Constitution permits health care. Well, it does. I mean, I can tell you exactly where and when it does. But there's nothing in the Constitution that could possibly justify an endless foreign occupation by the United States. In fact, if you read the Constitution, what you see is that the Constitution doesn't even contemplate a standing army, much less an army standing in Iraq or Afghanistan. So, you know, this is a message that I think resonates very deeply because it goes all the way back to the founding of this country. And it's a message of our own. Rather than listening to the other side natter endlessly about how the federal government supposedly has no power to solve our domestic problems, I think we need to take the initiative, explain to people in the original conception as reflected in the Great Seal of the United States, this is a country that should be looking always toward the olive branch and not toward the spears.
And do you think, I mean, there's the arguments, the discussions we've had in the Rethink Afghanistan work over the last year has been where to put the effort and resources, knowing resources are limited. Is it directed towards Congress to get them, as you say, to think? That's why we're calling the campaign Rethink. Or is it grassroots pressure that will scare people politically? Because you nailed it right in the beginning. You know, if George Bush were saying exactly the things that Obama is saying now about Afghanistan, Democrats would be burning down buildings and rioting in the streets, but it's not happening.
Well, I think we do what we can do in Congress, and I speak all the time about this, and I have some other ways that we have in mind to try to bring home to people the enormous cost of the war. The war in Afghanistan alone costs roughly as much as the entire health care reform bill each year. The war in Iraq costs even more than that. And we're talking about current out-of-pocket costs. There's an enormous, enormous future cost. There have been almost 2 million Americans who've served in Iraq and Afghanistan since the wars began. Roughly 250,000 of them came home with permanent brain damage. And those are people who we will be taking care of for the next half century or more at public expense. And of course, you know, the greatest expense of all is the expense to them, not just to us, but to them. So I think that we can try to bring this home to members of Congress effectively over time. Right now there's only about 60, 65, 70 votes against the war. But I think over time that will change. And in particular, it might be that the Republicans will tip. Maybe the Republicans will tip before the Democrats because, you know, frankly, they're against everything Obama does. So yes, yeah. Why should this be any different in the long run? But I think the ultimate way to end the war is to change the president's mind. And I've said on more than one occasion, I'd like to see him win 3 Nobel Peace Prizes. Not just the one he's got, but another one for ending the war in Iraq and another one for ending the war in Afghanistan. I think the president pays a lot of attention to the polls, even when it comes to an issue like the war. The opposition to the war in Afghanistan in particular has grown substantially in the past 2 years. And I think that your work and the work of other people who are similar-minded, just getting people to concentrate on why are we doing this, is going to, in the end, change the polls and quite possibly, as the polls change the president's mind. But because we are the most powerful country on earth, in fact, the most powerful that the world has ever seen, we have now reached the point where the worst things that ever happen to us are the things that we do to ourselves. And the war is the perfect example of that.
And one thing that I've been struck by and surprised is the way that whatever the content, whether it's the war stuff or some of the other great stuff you've been doing, is that you seem to also be breaking a lot of ground in the use of new media for an elected official. Is it the many children you have that led you to realize there's another way of communicating? Because it certainly wasn't being in Washington, D.C., where people have no notion about how to use these tools.
Well, I don't know any other way to reach a 17-year-old, you know? I mean, honestly, you know, if I try to reach my own daughter, she says, don't bother me, I'm texting. So there is definitely sort of a generational difference that you have to recognize. And I recognized a long time ago that I represent an incredibly varied district. In fact, the secret to our success in 2008, and I hope the Republicans aren't listening, but
we'll cut this part out if we need to.
Is that my opponent thought everybody was like him. You know, he thought everybody in the world was a rich, white, straight, born-again Christian. And that's actually not the district I represent. I just happened to notice it, and he didn't. And I think recognizing that means that you have to almost fall in love with the new media because that's where the audience is, at least a large part of the audience. There's plenty of people who simply don't watch TV anymore. I hardly ever watch TV anymore, and it's not just because I'm busy. It's because there's more interesting things that I can find when I select them myself, rather than having the great editor in the sky who determines what's on CBS or NBC selected for me. And that's not to criticize CBS or NBC. I think that they put on really interesting shows all the time, but they're competing against literally millions of alternatives right now, not just the 57 channels and nothing on that Bruce Springsteen sang about on cable TV, but even more choices than that now. My kids actually spend a lot of time on Hulu. They're much more likely to watch a TV show on Hulu than they are to watch a TV show that's put on at a certain time every week in a certain place. And I think that you've broken through entirely and reached and found your own audience and cultivated your own audience. And I think we've done the same. We have the largest number of subscribers on our YouTube channel in Congress, and I'm a freshman Democrat. I mean, we have more subscribers than Nancy Pelosi does. And frankly, in her case, a lot of people sort of have to. I mean, if you're the Capitol Hill correspondent for NBC, you don't have much choice. We've gotten over 6 million views on our YouTube channel. One video alone, my examination of Elizabeth Coleman at the Federal Reserve, there's 2 versions of it that are up. One has 2 million views, the other one has 1 million views. So 3 million views. It's the most watched congressional hearing in history. And it's because of YouTube. We have an enormous email list. We have hundreds of thousands of people who are on our email list, including a larger number of people in the district than our local newspaper circulation. If they mess with us, we can mess with them too. Yes. And that's a position that you could never do before. We literally have more people in our district on our email distribution list than the newspaper has subscribers. So the world is changing. It's changing in very interesting, dramatic ways. And one of the fundamental ways is that it's changing is that it is allowing people with a community of interest to come together. That's never been true before. Even going back to prehistoric times, you basically could never choose your neighbors. And now you can choose your mental neighbors. You can choose the people with whom you choose to spend your time, which is, of course, your most precious resource. So you find your audience, we found our audience. And it's reflected even in our campaign. We've set up the opportunity for people anywhere in the country to make phone calls on behalf of the campaign to people in the district. Our money bomb, which we've done twice now, to have organized online fundraising, was incredibly successful. And I'm most happy to tell you that we've done it twice. Both times we raised about $500,000 each time that we did it. And Michelle Bachmann tried to imitate us and raised only $105,000, which made me so happy.
That's great. Well, as we finish up, they're signaling me for time. Okay. 2 last questions. One is, when we were on the phone, you were talking about the organizing you're doing within your district, so the re-election campaign, which I thought was really interesting. You're putting, I believe it was more resources into registering and then ultimately turning out the vote than just stupid television commercials, which unfortunately too many do. Do you want to talk about that for a minute?
Well, sure. According to the Democratic Party, we had the best field campaign in the entire country in 2008. We had over 1 million human contacts, humans talking to humans in our district, and that district has 800,000 people and 500,000 voters. So the average voter was reached twice during our campaign. And we're doing the same thing all over again. We had people in the field doing our field work in the campaign 6 months ago. And we're well along in our plan concerning what to do. And it's really encouraging to me because I think that's how elections ought to be won. For instance, you have 2 ways to get on the ballot in Florida. You can write a $10,000 check, or you can get 4,000 signatures. I insisted that we do it by signature. It's harder, it's a lot harder, but it shows that the people are with you. So we got 4,000 signatures, and then we got 5,000 signatures, and then we got 6,000 signatures, and then we got 7,000 signatures. And then I said, well, that's enough. We think we've made our point. But on Monday, we'll be certified for this election in Florida on the basis of the fact that almost twice as many people decided that they wanted to see Alan Grayson on the ballot than we needed in order to put Alan Grayson's name on the ballot. And that's really encouraging to me. I think that's how a progressive campaign should be won, because ultimately what we're doing is fighting for more power for people. And the way you do that is to demonstrate people power. It's the same thing with our fundraising. You know, we have by far, by a wide margin, the largest donor base in Congress. Over 25,000 people contributed to the campaign in the last 3 months alone. And 3 months before that, it was 17,000, so it's actually building over time. And I'm really encouraged by the fact that we're demonstrating what people power looks like. We raised more money in the last quarter than any other member of Congress. I'm a freshman Democrat, imagine that. You know, you hear all the time about how the Democrats aren't accomplishing anything, there's no energy behind them. Well, it turns out that if you've got 25,000 people behind you, there is energy behind you. And to be number one as a freshman, I think is showing people that you can actually do a lot if you simply appeal to people for their support and they know you're fighting for them.
Well, the key being if you know that they know that you're fighting for them. Many appeal for support, but there's not a real sense that they're out there fighting the people's fight every day. And that's, you know, it's just great that you're doing that. Last question. So you can get any bill passed you want. You know, you have the famous wish. What would it be? What would be if there was one bill or one piece of legislation that you could implement by waving your hand here today?
Ending the war. I think that it not only has an enormous cost in both money and blood, but a corrosive effect on our national character. I think that it makes the world think that we're bullies, and it gives us this sort of video game view of the world and other people in it that is degrading to us and our national character. I think we need peace, and that's what I fight for every day. It's funny to say that you're fighting for peace, but it's something that's actually worth fighting for, because what it reflects is not only our national character, but our national goals. And I feel that if we could simply put this militarism that even Eisenhower complained about behind us, because it was Eisenhower who pointed out that every dollar you spend on bombs is a dollar you're not spending on education. If we put that behind us, then we can concentrate on the things that actually matter in people's lives: jobs, health, the education of our children, our roads, our bridges, the things that we use in our everyday lives. And that's actually what people were hoping for in 2008. And that's the change that we wanted and we're still waiting to get. So that's what I'd like to do.
Well, thank you on behalf of the audience here and everyone, the millions of people who are going to watch it on YouTube. It's just so great to have you there fighting the good fight and speaking up for democracy. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much.
Great.
Thank you very much.